Welcome to Aero Gaming. I'm Rush, and this is a flying tips video in FSX Steam with the stock Cessna 208 Grand Caravan. This is a response video for Reddit user Despiso, I think that's how you pronounce your name. They posted up a nice video of them shooting a straight-in approach into an airfield and making a really nice landing. And afterwards they asked for any tips or tricks or anything that was done wrong, and they just really wanted a critique. So I gave them a message and just pointed out a few things. It was a little hard to describe just with words, so this video is hopefully going to cover a few of the things out of that video. And then afterwards they had a few questions as well regarding trim and stuff like that. So hopefully this video is going to cover all those things. So first thing we'll look at here is setting takeoff trim in the Caravan, where basically just down the bottom here on the center pedestal it actually has a range for takeoff. And it has a range because it would actually differ for different center of gravity or different weight. So you could imagine if I had more weight in the tail, I wouldn't need to pull back on the stick as much, versus if I had a very nose heavy aircraft. So it gives you a range for somewhere that you could put that needle somewhere in there and you'd happily be able to take off without any issues. How this trim system differs from, say, a 737 trim, which I've just got a picture up here, is the 737 has very specific numbers, where there's quite a complex calculation that will figure out the exact trim setting for a given takeoff, and that would be due to passenger weight, fuel weight, and stuff like that. So in the bigger aircraft, the trim position is a very precise, measured number. But in light aircraft like the Cessna 208 that we're flying here, it's really not that big of a deal. There's more than enough control authority to deal with any changes in weight. So before we get flying, let's have a look at the flight plan here, or where we're going to fly and what we're going to do. So basically we're going to depart from Tuksuk Bay, or Papa Alpha Oscar Oscar, and we're going to depart just outbound there. And then we're going to track all the way along here to this point here, which is called Bury. And then from Bury we're going to track to Gibri, and Gibri direct to the airport Mikuroyak, I think is how you pronounce it, or Papa Alpha Mike Yankee. Now the reason I picked this route is this point here, Gibri, is exactly 5 nautical miles from the threshold. What that's going to do is that's going to help us figure out our straight-in approach and be really nice and precise and land well. Now, the reason why this is important is this is the exact point that Despiso's video starts, is 5 nautical miles from the end of the runway. So this is going to be a really good point to show the difference between the two flights, where at this point here Despiso was at about 130 knots and at 2,000 feet. Where what I'm going to show now is just what altitude we should be at and how we can get down. The other thing I want to show is a good landing doesn't start here. A good landing actually starts back here before you even start descending. And I'll talk about that when we're actually flying. But for the time being I'll just quickly brief just what I'm going to do. You're not going to see much of this because I'll probably cut most of it out. But after takeoff we'll climb to 500 feet AGL, so about 600 feet, where I'll make a right hand turn to intercept this outbound track, which is 236 degrees. Once I've joined that, I'll continue to climb up to 4,500 feet. And somewhere between here and Gibri, I'll descend down to 1,700 feet. Now you might be asking, why 1,700 feet? So let's do some math. Okay, so I'll try and keep this as less bland as possible. So let's basically just figure it out nice and quick here. So at 85 nautical miles, I'm doing 85 nautical miles an hour. So let's figure out how far I go in 1 minute. And that's quite simple, just 85 divided by 60. Which means in 1 minute I do 1.466, who cares about that number, nautical miles. So in 5 nautical miles, let's figure out how quickly I'm going to do that distance. So I take 5 nautical miles, I divide that by 1.41, because this is how fast I travel at 85 knots. It's going to take me 3.5 minutes to travel 5 nautical miles. 3.5 minutes. Now a nice descent profile is, we're going to talk perfect world here is a nice descent profile is a 500 foot per minute descent rate. So for 3.5 minutes, I'm going to times this by my descent rate, which is 500 feet a minute, and I get 1,773 feet. So at this point right here, at Gibri, if I wanted to descend perfectly at 500 foot per minute at 85 knots, I start at this point at 1,700 feet. Now it's not just that as well. I kind of cheated here a little, is this airport also has a nice approach. And this is the descent profile for that approach. Here's Gibri right here, and it wants me to be at Gibri at 1,700 feet. So this is a published approach, and it wants me to be at 1,700 feet, and that's going to give me a 3.04 degree descent profile. That's just about perfect. So why would I want to change anything other than that? Well, I don't. This is probably a really good rule of thumb to have with this aircraft, is that if I can be at 85 knots, that's the altitude I want to be at 5 nautical miles. So if I'm just using a basic GPS in FSX, it's really quite simple, is I just look to see until my distance from the airport is 5 nautical miles, and I want to plan to be at 1,700 feet at that point at 85 knots. Now for any difference though, let's say I'm faster, let's say I'm doing 100 knots, or let's say I'm at 2,000 feet, my descent rate has to increase. I can no longer now descend at 500 foot per minute. Why is that an issue? Well, the FAA actually stipulate that a stable approach should be set by 500 feet AGL, but also how it defines a stable approach is being a descent rate less than 1,000 foot per minute. So any descent rate that approaches or starts getting really close to 1,000 foot per minute, you should reject that and go around. I'll show a little video of that later as to when you should execute a go around. But any change outside those speeds and those conditions, which is being at 1,700 feet at 85 knots, means you have to descend at a faster rate, which means an unstable approach. This is not what we want. We want to be nice and stable. And yeah, you could argue in a single high-wing aircraft that a single-engine high-winged aircraft that you can descend at a steeper angle than 3 degrees, and you'd be right. But here, if we're trying to be a nice professional pilot and have a nice stable approach, why not? Why not practice flying really precisely? And that's what this video is about, really, isn't it? Is a stable straight-in approach where we're using some data from the real world as well as just some common sense flying. Okay, so let's go flying, and we'll start off with the pre-takeoff brief. So this will be a flaps 20 takeoff with trim in the takeoff detent using full power. Rotation speed is 70 knots, thereafter I'll climb at 100 knots, retracting flaps on schedule. Departure is a straight out, and I'm going to climb to 500 feet and then make a right hand turn to intercept the outbound track of 246, climbing to 3,000 feet. Now, why I'm introducing a pre-takeoff brief is it's a good thing to do in approaching or landing, and it doesn't have to be as formal as that. It could just be as simple as I'm taking off to 1,000 foot, making a right-hand turn, and going to climb to the outbound track, or anything like that. The reason you do this is to just reinforce what you're going to do. Anyway, I'll just do quick pre-takeoff checks here. So set power, condition lever, check trim, of course, because these are the things that will kill you. And oh, hang on, I just forgot to set the GPS for the autopilot here. Okay, so let's go through the takeoff roll here. So we'll bring power up. And power is set. T's and P's are okay. Airspeed's alive. 60 knots, 70 knots, and rotate. And here I'm just going to raise the nose up until I see positive rate. There we go. And we're going to aim to climb out at 100 knots here. And we'll start retracting the flaps. Now that first stage of flaps can be retracted at 85 knots and then flaps up at 95 knots. These are all speeds that you should know. I didn't want to cover the speeds and stuff like that in this video because the video is going to be more, it's all about the straight-in approach at the other end. So these items I could bring up in another video later. Anyway, we'll start this right-hand turn as we keep climbing out. You see the speed just dropped away on me there. And also a thing to point out there is I just changed the heading bug. Is you should change the heading bug before entering into any maneuver, so you know where you're turning to, because as you can see I can't see anything out the front of the aircraft. I have no visual reference. So turn the heading bug to where you want to turn. So you can see I turned it past the course deviation needle there. That's just so I can intercept that track there on the GPS on the left. Anyways, we climb out, we just keep monitoring things. There we go, we're on heading. Still aiming for that 100 knots. We got a little bit slow through that turn, but it's okay. And it's about now I can start thinking about getting the autopilot set up here. I'm going to cheat a little bit for the outbound part. Using the autopilot here, the autopilot is an aid. Don't think of it as cheating, as I just said, but it's an aid, and it really will help you with the descent. So anyway, I've already I preset everything on the ground, so I've set autopilot heading mode just to hold the heading until I cross that track there. As soon as I see that needle moving, there we go, I'll hit nav. Not quite yet, wait for the needle to come across, and then the autopilot will follow the GPS track that I've got there. There we go. And now all I have to do, the thing to note with the 208 is there is no autopilot coupling with airspeed. So if I set a vertical climb rate that is too high, the aircraft will just keep pitching those up until it stalls and falls out of the sky. So it's very important when you do have autopilot set in this aircraft is to monitor your airspeed very, very closely. Well, we can see at 1200 foot per minute there, I'm sitting at around 100 knots, so it's a good number to think about at full power, 1200 foot a minute at 100 knots. It's there we go, 1000 foot to go. It's important in these type of aircraft is to think of numbers as performance. If I fly at 100 knots, flaps up, with my correct attitude, of course, I should get this performance, and that performance is 1200 foot per minute climb at full power at about 100 knots. Anything outside of that, if I pitch down, I'll have a slightly higher speed, 500 foot to go. Why I'm making these call-outs as well as with the altitude is it's to remind you. It's not to tell anyone else, it's just to remind you as a pilot that if I start monitoring something else, like if I go, okay, I'm just going to check my airspeed or I want to check on track, in the back of my mind, I know I just said there's 500 foot to go. So in a few seconds, my gaze is going to return back to the altimeter and just check and see, okay, yeah, so we are leveling out at 4,500 feet, so the autopilot is working well. Also, you might have just heard, I just pulled the power back. Entering into the cruise point of this, so we're just going to pull the power back and settle into the cruise. I'm going to try and aim for around that 130, 140 knots that Despiso was at his approach, and anyway, we'll just settle into the cruise here. Well, we're not going to settle into the cruise for too long. We have a very short flight, so I need to start thinking about my landing and the descent. And as I said at the start of the video, a good landing really starts way before you actually lower the nose and start descending into the airfield. So the first thing I'll go over right now is actually I'll do a pre-landing brief. And again, as I said when I take off, why this is important is it tells you what I'm going to do, and then I can figure out how I'm going to do it. So here's just a basic brief. So this will be a straight-in approach for runway 23. I'll hand fly the approach. My final approach fix will be at 5 nautical miles from the threshold. That's Point Gibri. I will be at 1,700 feet stable and airspeeds at 85 knots. The missed approach or go around required will be a visual back to the circuit, climbing at 80 knots with flaps 20. This, however, will be a flap 30 landing with an over the threshold speed of 75 to 85 knots. Now again, it doesn't have to be as formal as that. You could just say I'm going to be at 1,500 feet, 3 nautical miles from the runway, or 5 nautical... It doesn't matter. But now I have a chance to figure out how to get there. So I know Point Burry is 8 nautical miles from Point Gibri, and at Gibri I want to be at 1,700 feet. Right now I'm at 4,500 feet. So I'll just do some really quick math, and I just popped up a little display here, so this will show you the points. Basic basic math here is at 60 nautical miles, I'm doing 1 nautical mile a minute. At 120 nautical miles, I'm doing 2 nautical miles a minute. So I can basically use that to figure out what my descent profile will be. I want to descend at 500 foot per minute because I want to be nice and stable in a slow, gentle descent. So I'm just going to do some pilot math here. So pilot math is I need to lose 2,800 feet, or let's call it 3,000 feet for easy math. That's going to be 6 minutes. It's going to take me 6 minutes to descend from my current altitude to 1,700 feet. Well, okay, we'll make it 5.5 minutes. Nice and accurate. At my current speed, I'm planning 120. Let's plan a descent at 120 knots. It's going to take me, or I'm going to cross 12 nautical miles of land distance to descend down to that altitude. So my descent point is going to be somewhere before Bury. To get to Gibri, it's 8 nautical miles. So 8, and it's going to take me 12 nautical miles to descend. So approximately 3 or 4 nautical miles before Bury is where I'm going to start my descent. And that little nifty overlay I've got there is just going to show you when the aircraft starts descending and the profile that I'm actually going to use. You will notice I did make a mistake there, as the aircraft is already descending on the descent profile there, but oh well, it's okay. And you'll also note this is not telling you how to fly a precision approach or an NDB approach or anything like that. I'm really just telling you, using this as a guide to tell you how to fly visually. Okay, so that was hard enough to explain. The math is a little bit hard, but we'll figure it out. The next point I want to make is I'm going to show another video of an approach I tried. This approach, I made a mistake and I was only slightly too fast, and it completely changed the approach. So we'll talk about Despiso's video. At 3 nautical miles, he was at 2,000 feet AGL, doing 120 knots. In this approach, he would literally be, he's 35 knots too fast and 500 to 1,000 foot too high. This is huge. Like, this is quite a long way off where you'd want to be stable. Why this is important with, say, a light aircraft, this is only for light aircraft, is you don't have speed brakes on this aircraft. So for me to descend more, I need to point the nose further to the ground. When I'm pointing the nose further to the ground, my airspeed is going to increase. So I'm never going to lose that extra 35 nautical miles that I've got there, that 35 knots, sorry. What you want to think about when flying these kind of aircraft is being on speed, especially in the landing stage. You want to be on speed before lowering the nose. And that involves pulling the power back, letting the aircraft settle to speed, so trimming the aircraft back as it starts losing speed, and then letting the aircraft's nose drop. And we'll see here we're just starting to descend now. So we'll set down at a 500 foot per minute here. We did our basic math. We guessed, 12 nautical miles away from Gibri, 11. So we started descending 11 nautical miles from Gibri. So that should put us at a 500 foot per minute descent rate at Gibri at 120 knots at 1,700 feet. Well, actually, that's not quite true. I actually need to be at 85 knots at Gibri. So at some point between Bury and Gibri, which we can now see on the GPS, I need to slow from 120 knots to 85 knots. And this is important, because what that means is it's actually going to take me longer to do that same leg of the route there. So my math is probably going to be a little bit off. It means I'm probably going to be a little bit lower than what I thought I would be, but that's okay in this point. The thing to note here is I want to get the aircraft below that white arc on the airspeed indicator. As soon as I'm below in that white arc there, I can start lowering the flaps. And lowering the flaps is going to really help me keep on speed throughout the approach. Yeah, don't be scared to get your flaps out early in the approach to really keep you on speed. So I'll just transition over to the other video I was talking about earlier where I muffed up a landing. We're all stable in this descent, and we can see we're 4 minutes away, so this other video is just quite short. Okay, so here's an approach that went badly very quickly, but also subtly. So we're set up on a nice approach here, less than a mile away from the end of the runway at 85 knots at 500 foot per minute descent rate. Just about perfect. But it's about now the airspeed just starts creeping up just a little, and it just starts touching on 90 knots. My rate of descent stays the same, and it's feeling fairly stable here at the moment. But this 90 knots here is actually what ruined the approach. So I continue the approach and just start bringing the power back. You'll see there the torque indicator there, so I'm just bringing the power back to get that airspeed back on schedule. Rate of descent staying the same at 500 foot per minute. And the runway looks pretty nice. I've got a good picture out of the cockpit there. But now things are going wrong is the rate of descent starts increasing. So now I'm descending to about 750 foot per minute. I'm at 80 knots, which is okay. But I start adding a little bit of power here. This little bit of power just makes me overshoot. Why this is so important is I've got a tailwind and I've got a really short runway. This is 3,000 foot of runway. Now I've got no chance of landing. I'm approaching 90 knots, I'm too high, and I should be executing a go around. Instead, I rage quit. When you're trying to make a video for YouTube, but yeah. Alright, back to the flight at hand. We can see we're 3 minutes away from Gibri at about 125 knots, descending at 500 foot per minute. So it's about now, I'm in the white arc, I'm going to bring out the first stage of flaps, and that's really going to help me decelerate, because really 3 minutes to Gibri is not a lot of time to decelerate, and I still need to lose at this point close to 30 knots. But we're going to continue this descent down here. While we're in this descent, let's just do a quick pre-landing check. So the basics is I'll just check the brakes, the undercarriage is obviously down and locked, we're in a fixed gear aircraft. The prop pitch, you just heard it come all the way up, so pitch is to max. Fuel is sufficient for landing, and what else have we got? Hatches and harnesses are secure, and obviously turn around and tell all the passengers to make sure they're buckled up. So continuing the approach here, we can just start to monitor and see how we're going. So we can see I've got about 2 minutes until I hit Gibri, and again just a reminder, at Gibri I want to be at 85 knots at 1700 feet. So right now I've got about 500 foot to go. So I'm going to be about a minute early on the descent, but that's okay. We'll just level off the descent a little and just bring the rate of descent back and go from there. Just to help really slow down, we'll pull out flaps 20 there. And there we go, we can see the speeds just starting to come online. So I'm about 90 knots. Add a little bit of power here because we just lowered the rate of descent to about 200-300 foot a minute. There we go, so 300 foot to go, about 2 minutes, just about at Gibri. You can see the difference here is we're in a nice, real stable approach. My airspeed's not fluctuating. I'm not having to lose 30-35 knots to make the descent to the airfield. The aircraft's in a really nice, stable position. Okay, so we're a minute away from Gibri. I'm going to get rid of the GPS. I'm not going to cheat on the way in, and as briefed, I'll be flying this by hand. Zoom in here and just see how close we are. 3 nautical miles, 85 knots. Well, it's probably going to take us a little over a minute, right? Yeah, so the minute's just a little bit wrong there. It's somewhere between a minute and 2 minutes will be at Gibri. If we really wanted to be precise, we could use the clock and time out a minute and a half and away we go. But after all, this is a visual approach, so that's probably actually, that reminds me, is just because it's a visual approach doesn't mean you can't use your instruments. You use your instruments to check the performance. So the basic acronym is power and attitude equals performance. And the only way you can check your performance is with your instruments. And if you don't have a clear set out guideline, well then what are you checking your performance against? So just because you're flying a visual or a VFR approach or whatever you want to call it, it doesn't mean that you should give up on your instruments and just look out of the cockpit. That doesn't tell you the full story. Okay, so we're approaching Gibri here. I'm going to be preparing to make a left-hand turn. We'll see that the course deviation needle, the yellow needle on the HSI, is already pointing on runway heading, and the heading bug is set for runway heading as well. I'll pull last stage of flaps once I've started making the turn onto final, which will probably need a little bit more power just to keep the speed up. Actually no, the power setting we got here should be okay. There we go, so start making the turn, get rid of that GPS, and start our descent at 500 foot per minute. And it's at this point here we really want to start monitoring things. So we've pulled the power back, gone to last stage of flaps, so that's flaps 30, and we're still at about 85 knots. A little bit sloppy in that turn there, but that's okay. And now all we're doing is we're looking at the runway and checking performance. So I want to see that runway not move from about that point in the field of view there. I call it the picture outside, right? So I want to keep that picture for as long as possible, and eventually I'll hit the runway. But checking the picture is not the whole story. I need to check my instruments. So here I'm almost entirely focusing on airspeed and attitude. So I check my airspeed, and then I look outside, check attitude, I check my airspeed, and then I check my vertical speed, I check outside. So there's a bit of a cockpit flow here to making the descent nice and stable. And really trying to pin this speed on 85 knots. Like I said in that other video, this still has a 10 knot tailwind, so it's a little bit more difficult. As soon as this speed increases a little bit, the effect that has at the other end, i.e. the runway, is at an increase. So we really want to keep this speed at 85 knots and really slow it down to 80 to 75 over the threshold there. Okay, a little bit of crosswind there. Also, yes, for Despiso, trimming as I'm doing this, you notice the control column really is not moving fore and aft too much. I'm almost entirely flying this descent just on trim, so just with nice small jabs to just put the trim in the right area, and then all I need to do is just use the control column to roll to keep the wings level. That changes in the flare, so I do not trim. It's a bad practice to use trim to actually flare the aircraft. And the reason being is for a missed approach. Is if I have to go to full power on short final and I've started using trim to flare, well, I may not have enough control authority to hold the nose down when I bring the power up. And that's really bad. Low airspeed, nose pointing up at the sky, you're going to crash a perfectly good aeroplane. So here we brought the power back just to let that airspeed drop to 80 knots. And we've seen the rate of descent has started to increase here. This tailwind, all you grizzled old sim pilots here will notice that the approach looks quite shallow, and it is. And the approach is shallow because there is a tailwind. If you have a headwind, the approach is a little bit more steep. All the numbers will stay the same, it's just the angle of approach will change. We're at 80 knots. We're starting to look a little bit still high here, but we should be able to plop it down. Bring the power all the way back over the threshold, there's 75 knots, and start the flare with the elevator. Flare, 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 and hold that attitude until the aircraft touches down. Perfect. Add some brakes and try and track center line of the runway because we are professional pilots, and bring the aircraft to a stop. And that runway we landed on just there was a 3,000 foot runway. So what I'll do is when I pull up here is I'll just show how it looks from the outside. So this aircraft, a perfect landing, you should be able to put it down in around 1,500 feet of runway. Oh, hang on, tidy up in here first, bring the flaps up. Also, just quickly have a look at the trim position right there. The trim position is well below the takeoff detent there, so that gives you a rough idea for where you want the trim to be set, but of course it changes with weight and stuff like that. Okay, so let's have a look how much runway we used. Yep, so we used probably 2,200 feet of runway, maybe a little bit more. Well, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your time. It is a long video and there was a lot of information in it. I'll continue this kind of video series, I think, if I get more messages from people on Reddit or I see other responses on YouTube, as I think it's a valuable thing to talk about, because no matter who you are, there's always something you could do better when you're flying an aircraft. Anyway, thanks again for watching. This is Aero Gaming, and I'm Rush.